All right, so today we're going deep on some, well, pretty disturbing stuff. We're going to be looking at excerpts from the Jewish religion, its influence today, self-published, by the way, back in 1964 by a woman named Elizabeth Dilling. And, well, let's just say this book is a textbook case of anti-Semitic propaganda.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's easy to dismiss something like this as a relic of the past, right?
Sure.
But the thing is, the themes, the tactics, they're still shockingly relevant.
Absolutely.
So before we dive into the finer points of Dilling's, shall we say, unique worldview, can you give us a little background? Who was Elizabeth Dilling, and why should we even care about what she had to say?
Well, Dilling, she wasn't some fringe figure, you know. She was a big name in anti-Semitic circles, unfortunately. And her book, well, it wasn't an isolated incident either. It was part of this long, dangerous history of spreading lies about Jewish people. And the thing is, the themes she uses, the conspiracy theories, the twisting of religious texts, it's all stuff we still see today, just maybe in a different package.
Right. Yeah. And speaking of packaging, I got to say, this book, it's less of a cohesive argument and more like a jumbled collage of accusations and random quotes. You know?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's actually a classic propaganda move, by the way.
Is it?
Yeah. You overwhelm the reader with this mishmash of supposed evidence, and it creates this illusion that there's got to be something to it, right? Like, where there's smoke, there's fire.
Right.
But if you actually stop and look at her claims, they fall apart pretty quickly.
Yeah, and one of the most, unsettling things she does is she keeps pushing this narrative of Jewish people as this, like, monolithic conspiratorial force. Like, they're pulling the strings behind everything. It's kind of like something out of a bad spy movie. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a hallmark of propaganda, right?
Yeah.
You take complex issues, complex groups of people, and you boil them down to these simplistic, often really sinister caricatures. She's tapping into these really old anti-Semitic stereotypes, making Jewish people out to be this shadowy, all-powerful group to make them seem threatening.
Right, like the us versus them playbook.
Exactly. And that, let me tell you, is a very effective way to stir up fear and distrust.
And she doesn't shy away from the specifics either. I mean, the blood libel accusations she throws around, it's just the idea that Jews are using the blood of Christian children in rituals. I mean, come on, that is some scary, messed up stuff.
Yeah, and that's a perfect example of how dangerous this type of rhetoric can be. I mean, blood libel, that's not a new thing, unfortunately.
Right.
It's a completely baseless accusation that's been around for centuries, and it has been used to justify violence and discrimination against Jewish communities for generations. Dilling didn't invent it, but she is definitely using it to demonize and incite hatred.
Yeah. And you know what else really got to me? It's how she twists the Talmud, you know, which for anyone who doesn't know, that's like a central text of Jewish law and tradition, but she twists it to fit her narrative. It's like she's playing this gotcha game, you know, just ripping quotes totally out of context.
Oh, 100%. And there's a name for that, by the way, that tactic. It's called proof texting.
Oh, proof texting.
Yeah, it's a favorite tactic of, well, propagandists in general.
Yeah.
Because it gives this illusion of, like, scholarly credibility. They find a quote that seems to support their point, but they completely disregard the historical context, the nuance, the larger message of the text.
So it's not about genuinely engaging with the Talmud. It's about exploiting the fact that most people aren't Talmudic scholars, right? To twist the meaning for her own agenda.
Exactly. She's creating this straw man, this completely distorted caricature of Judaism that's meant to scare and mislead people.
Yeah, and she goes for it. Like, she actually tries to claim that the Talmud instructs Jews to hate and exploit non-Jews. I mean, come on. Anybody who knows even a little bit about Judaism knows that is completely false.
Yeah, I mean, it's a blatant misrepresentation of Jewish teachings. The Talmud, like any complex religious text, of course it's open to interpretation.
Right.
But to say that it advocates for hatred and exploitation is just, it's ludicrous.
Okay, so we're seeing this pattern here, right? She takes these age-old anti-Semitic tropes and then tries to dress them up with this pseudo-intellectual approach to give them legitimacy. And she does the same thing with history, too, right? Like with the Russian Revolution, for example.
Oh, absolutely. That's where it actually gets even more insidious, because she starts to weave these grand, sweeping narratives that tap into people's anxieties and prejudices.
So how does she twist something as complex, I mean, as multifaceted as the Russian Revolution to fit into this hateful agenda?
Well, she latches onto this idea that's been floating around for centuries, this idea that Jewish people are somehow inherently tied to communism.
Oh, boy.
Which, of course, is just another simplistic, reductive narrative that ignores the realities of the revolution and the diversity of the people involved.
Yeah, I mean, blaming historical events on one specific group, especially a group that's already been marginalized and persecuted, I mean, that's the old trick in the book, sadly. But it's still it's disheartening to see it play out, even in a book published decades ago. So she's basically just like cherry-picking events and people from history to fit this narrative she's already decided on, huh? Like anything that doesn't fit with this whole Jewish communist conspiracy gets swept under the rug.
That's the danger with propaganda, especially when it tries to dress itself up as history. Dilling's very intentional about how she presents information, leaving out key details, twisting facts, even making stuff up to make her conclusions seem like the only possible answer.
It's most funny, in a way. Like she tries to present these huge, complex events, right? Like the Russian Revolution, and act like it was all part of some simple plan. Like, aha, see? It was the Jewish bankers all along.
Right. And the reality is, of course, the Russian Revolution, like anything that big and messy in history, had so many different factors at play. Social unrest, economic instability, political upheaval. To boil it all down to this simplistic narrative of Jewish control, I mean, it's not just inaccurate, it's incredibly dangerous.
It's like she's trying to build this whole alternate reality, right?
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
everything bad that happens can be traced back to this shadowy group of Jewish people secretly controlling everything.
And that kind of thinking, that conspiratorial mindset, it can be really seductive. It offers simple answers to really complex problems and creates these easy scapegoats for societal problems. That's why it's so important to be aware of these tactics, to recognize when we're being manipulated by these overly simplistic explanations.
Okay, so we've talked about how Dilling distorts religious texts. We've talked about how she twists history. But she also goes after something else that I found really interesting, a Passover song. Can you tell me more about her interesting interpretation of Chad Gadya?
Oh, yeah, the Chad Gadya example. Yeah, that is a perfect example of how she manipulates even the most harmless things to fit her hateful agenda.
Right.
So for those who don't know, Chad Gadya is this playful, allegorical song that's traditionally sung at the end of the Passover Seder. It's basically this cumulative rhyme about a little goat, but somehow Dilling manages to twist it into this proof of Jewish world domination.
Wait, hold on. How does she get that from a song about a goat?
She takes the imagery of the song totally out of context. I mean, completely ignoring the actual meaning and imposing her own bizarre interpretation. She latches on to the chain of events in the song, how each character gets, taken out by the next, and she uses that as a metaphor for this supposed Jewish conspiracy to overthrow, well, everything, and seize control.
It just blows my mind how she can take something so joyful and turn it into something so sinister.
That is the insidious nature of propaganda, right? It can take something familiar, something as innocent as a children's song, and warp it into a tool to spread fear and distrust.
Honestly, going through these excerpts, it's hard not to get angry.
Yeah.
But I guess that's why we're doing this, to try and understand how this stuff works so we can spot it and call it out.
100%. Because here's the thing, and this is really important. Even though this book was written decades ago, the things Dilling is talking about, the themes she's exploiting, they're still very much alive today.
Wait, really? I mean, I know anti-Semitism hasn't gone anywhere, sadly, but this book just seems like such a relic of a bygone era.
Anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is definitely not a relic of the past. And while the specific language and the images might have changed over time, the underlying themes of Dilling's propaganda, the conspiracy theories, the scapegoating, the dehumanization, they're still being used to spread hatred and incite violence today.
So how do we even begin to counter something that feels so pervasive, so insidious?
It starts with recognizing it for what it is. We need to be able to identify these harmful stereotypes and tropes, whether they're presented outright or disguised as something more, legitimate.
So media literacy, critical thinking, those are essential, right? We can't just take in information passively. We had to be actively questioning what we read, hear, and see.
Exactly. We need to be asking, who's creating this content? What's their agenda? What's the historical context? Are they using reliable sources? Are they presenting a balanced perspective?
Those are all great points. But it can feel overwhelming, right? Like every corner of the internet could be a breeding ground for this kind of stuff. So what do we do when we encounter these warped narratives, whether it's about the Russian Revolution or any other aspect of Jewish history or identity? How do we actually challenge them effectively?
It definitely can feel overwhelming. But that's why it's so important to remember that we're not powerless in this situation. We all have a role to play in combating hate and misinformation.
So where do we even start? How do we push back against this wave of misinformation? It feels kind of overwhelming, to be honest.
It can definitely feel that way, but even small acts of kind of resistance can make a difference. One of the most powerful things we can do is just to counter those harmful narratives with, facts, with truth.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. But it's tricky, right? Like,
Yeah.
how do you convince someone who's like already bought into a conspiracy theory that they're wrong? It feels almost impossible sometimes.
You're right, it's not always easy. Sometimes the best you can do is just plant a seed of doubt. You might not change their mind completely in one go, but if you can get them to, question their assumptions a little bit, just consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they remain manipulated, that's a step in the right direction.
So it's about having those conversations, even if they're uncomfortable, and being ready to back up what we're saying with, actual evidence, credible sources.
Exactly. And it's not just about engaging with the people who, already hold these hateful views. It's also about educating ourselves and each other about, the history of anti-Semitism, how to recognize propaganda, and just how to be more discerning about the information we're consuming.
You've mentioned the importance of historical context a few times. Can you talk about that a bit more? Like, how can understanding history help us fight back against modern anti-Semitism?
Absolutely. Anti-Semitism, like all forms of prejudice, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It's rooted in centuries of misinformation, discrimination, and violence. And unfortunately, these historical prejudices, they can resurface in ways you might not expect, often disguised as something else entirely.
So by understanding the historical roots of these harmful stereotypes and tropes, we're better equipped to recognize them and challenge them when they pop up in our own time.
Exactly. For example, Dilling's attempts to link Jewish people to communism, that is not some new idea she came up with. That trope has been around for centuries, and it's been used to justify everything from expulsions to pogroms. By understanding that historical context, by seeing how that narrative has been used to such devastating effect in the past, we can better understand just how high the stakes are in these conversations today.
That's a really powerful point. It's not just about correcting a mistake, it's about understanding the very real consequences that this kind of rhetoric can have.
Precisely. And that's why it's so crucial that we speak out against all forms of hate and prejudice, that we challenge these harmful ideologies whenever and wherever we encounter them.
Because silence, as they say, equals complicity.
Exactly. By speaking out, by refusing to let these hateful ideologies go unchallenged, we can help to create a world where everyone feels safe and respected.
Well said. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into Dilling's, let's just say, troubling work, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that understanding how propaganda works, especially understanding the historical context, is absolutely crucial to fighting back against it. We can't afford to dismiss this as just something from the past.
Yeah.
We have to actively engage with these ideas if we want to stop history from repeating itself.
I couldn't agree more. We all have a responsibility to be informed, to be critical thinkers, and to stand up for what's right. It's a constant process, but it's a fight worth fighting.
I completely agree. Well, on that note, a huge thank you to you for taking this deep dive with us. It's been, well, eye-opening, to say the least.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us. Keep asking those tough questions, stay curious, and never be afraid to speak out against hate and injustice.